of everything else. And I had to interview Count Basie when he came in. So, I mean, I was, I don't know, 16 by that point, I believe. So I was just truly nervous, you know. So he came in. I was rather shocked to find I'd seen him on the steel pier. I noticed that when they opened the curtain, he was already seated at his piano. And they commenced to play, and everything looked fine. Then the curtain would close, and a singer would come out, and the band would play behind the curtain. And then when it opened again, Count Basie was still at the piano. I had no idea when they brought him in that, one, he was in a wheelchair, and he was on oxygen.
Oh, wow.
You know? My God, yeah. I couldn't believe, you know, that this man still had this tremendous will to perform. But they brought him in, and he could tell I was a little bit, I tried not to show it, but I guess they could see in my eyes I was rather surprised to see him in a wheelchair. He did everything to reassure me. He's like, oh, don't be nervous now. Don't be nervous. I says, I'm fine. Don't worry. I know all about you. And he says, how old are you, 12, 13? Oh, yeah. It was kind of in a nice way. And so we went on the air, and I introduced my ladies and gentlemen, the one, the only, Count Basie. And we proceeded to talk, and I had a lot of questions for him. And when we broke for the commercial, he leans over and he says, now, Michael, you're doing a beautiful job. Don't mess it up now. But just one thing, it's not Basie, it's Basie with like a Z. So I never knew that. I think I'm one of the few people that actually was aware of that, you know, so I felt like I was in the club, you know. And it was funny with him because pretty soon he started interviewing me, you know, which was, I couldn't believe it. He was interviewing me and then asking me, like, which of his recordings I liked the most, and what were some of my favorite bands and why. And it was funny, but it took all the stress off me, and I think he knew that, you know. But he was all I remember too. That at that time, this is before your time, Trey, but there was something on TV called The Gong Show. You know, and they had a feature on there where they had somebody named Gene the Dancing Machine would come out. Every show would you know, this guy was horrible. He would just kind of shuffle around, and they'd throw balloons and boulders at him and all kinds of things landed on him. But the theme song they used was Count Basie's Jumping at the Woodside. And I had mentioned it to him, and he smiled, and he says, you know, I get 25 cents every time they play that. So he said, I love Gene the Dancing Machine. May that man dance forever. You know, so that was just wonderful. And, you know, again, like I say, how fortunate I was to have met all of these people, because most of them weren't around much longer. You know, it was just extraordinary that I was given that opportunity. Now, some of the people we had on, I got to tell you this story before I forget. This is truly outlandish, but Richard had this habit of we'd play a record, and by the time it got finished, he couldn't remember who it was. You know, we'd be on the air, and he was just dumbfounded. He had no idea. So he would say, and that was Basil Fomine and the Clico Club Eskimo Orchestra. And he did this many times. He just always, it was I don't care who it was wound up being Basil Fomine. Basil Fomine was an actual band leader. I think his greatest fame lies in the fact that his name is mentioned in one of the Honeymooner episodes. And he actually existed. He was the band leader for the Canada Dry radio show for many years. But a very obscure name. I mean, you know, who knows him? So one night we're sitting there and the phone rings and I answered it, and this very elderly voice from far away says, It says Big Band Radio Show. I said, yeah. Well, I said, how can I help you? I thought it was somebody calling it for a request or something. Well, my name is Basil Fomine. I almost dropped the phone. And this is Basil Fomine, and he told me that he had a friend in Atlantic City that listened to our show regularly and said, called him in Florida where he had retired to, and said, they play your records all the time, Basil, you should give them a call. So he did. And I told Richard, I put him on hold. I said, you're not going to believe this. There's Basil Fomine on the line. And he did the same thing I did. It just looked like somebody stabbed him in the back. And so Dick got him on the phone and was interviewing. And, of course, we didn't have any Basil Fomine records. I mean, who did? So I went out in the hall and I grabbed as many of these obscure instrumentals I could find. Like people, the virtual unknown people, and we would play them. And of course, Dick was passing them off as recordings by Basil Fomine. And of course, Basil had no idea whatsoever. He couldn't hear him. So that went on for quite a while. But I thought that was the craziest thing that ever happened. I couldn't believe it. But it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun. Like I said, I will always look back on those years as probably being some of the greatest years of my life to had that opportunity. And the casinos came in, and we got some more named people that showed up when they arrived. I think the worst one, I could not stand this guy, was a fellow that was the house conductor for Resorts International, which is first casino to open. It was actually right across the street from the pier. Well, this guy started to show up, and he would commandeer our show to advertise himself. Mm-hmm. Every Saturday, he would show up with an armful of his records, and we despised the guy. He would just take over the entire show. I guess the only good thing about him was he had married this beautiful showgirl about half his age, so she would show up. She was nice, but his name was Cy Zentner. Now, that name probably means nothing to anybody today, but his only hit recording was an instrumental of Up a Lazy River in the 60s. But this guy was just so obnoxious. He actually said that he was a better trombonist than Tommy Dorsey. Well, and he wasn't. Oh my gosh, he wasn't. And like I said, every Saturday for 4 weeks, it got to the point where we'd get in the studio and the door would buzz, and I got so tired of him. I picked up the intercom and I says, we're not broadcasting tonight. There's been a fire in the studio. That was the end of him. I actually got congratulated for that bold move, And I have to tell you too about WFPG radio. WFPG Radio was, the call letters stood for World's Finest Playground. That was Atlantic City's name at one time. They were known by that moniker. And it was actually the interior would have been an aquarium exhibit. Mm-hmm. And so it was weird because the little studios we had were all had all been formerly had been aquariums. I think we got in there. I think our show was in the octopus tank or something, because it always had this strange smell. we could never get rid of. They used to have all those little, those little car fresheners that look like pine Christmas trees and things. They had these hanging all over the place, like they were trying to ward off vampires or something with them. But nothing could cover that odor. But it was convenient because, they made ready-made studios. They were just perfect, with the glass and everything like that. But I think probably, this sounds really weird, but I guess maybe the biggest thrill I ever got was my dad listened to WFPG all my growing up years. And there was a fellow He was called the Dean of Atlantic City Radio. And he had a wonderful voice. He had a voice like, I don't know if you recall him, Les Tremaine, one of the great, he was an actor, and also one of the, Les Tremaine, he was also an actor later on, but he was one of the most recognized voices on radio.
Oh, yeah.
And I grew up listening to this voice all my life. And I remember standing in the hallway one time, and he came in, and I could hear the voice down the hallway, and I thought, oh my gosh, he actually is real. This man is a real person. And the voice came up getting louder and louder, and of course I finally got to meet him. And the funny thing about him was he met my expectations of what I thought he should look like. You know, he was very nattily attired with a bow tie and a tweed suit on, and his name was Ed Davis. And Ed actually was just a gold mine of information for me, because he was a historian, amongst one thing. He knew everything about Atlantic City. And I learned so much about the town that I never knew of. But mostly, I enjoyed his stories because he was he was the announcer for many of the big band radio shows of the 30s and 40s, early 50s. So he could tell us all about some of the band leaders that weren't around anymore. And I guess one of the most eye-opening one for me was his story about Glenn Miller. Now, Trey, I don't know if you've ever seen the Glenn Miller story with Jimmy Stewart. No. Have you ever seen that picture?
No.
Well, if you watch it, you know, he's portrayed as Glenn Miller's portrayed as a sentimental, really lovable chocolate bar of a guy, you know. But in reality, though, Glenn Miller was a rather humorless taskmaster, a real martinet. He drove his band unrelentingly toward perfection, but he was definitely not known for his humor at all. But the thing is, you have to remember to be a top band back in those days, you had to be an excellent aggregation. You know, the sloppiness was not tolerated, because for every Glenn Miller and so forth, there was probably 150 other bands throughout the country competing with you. But I was rather taken back by that. I had no idea he was nothing like that. And he told me once that he was talking to Glenn Miller backstage, and he was very foul mood. It was on the Steel Pier, and he said, well, what's wrong? And Glenn Miller, this is early in his career, but apparently on the marquee, they had spelled his name as Gene Mueller. It says you how long ago it was, you know. So, it was pretty bad, you know. They fixed it. And I guess the other one he told me about, I was really interested in, was the great Tommy Dorsey, one of my favorite bands and band leaders. Apparently the way that Tommy Dorsey would fire people was they'd be on the bandstand and playing to the audience, and if somebody screwed up their solo, Dorsey would kind of walk behind them and tap them on the neck with his trombone slide. Now, how's that for a way of getting fired? I mean, that is like the evilest thing I've ever heard. You know, just tap him on right while he's playing. You know, just tap him on the neck that was it. You were through. But he was telling me that when they played on the Steel Pier stage, he remember during the rehearsal that Dorsey was walking around and he was shifting his feet on the stage, and Ed couldn't figure this out, and he says, what's wrong? And he says, I'm not playing in this. This stage is too damn splintery. We're not playing in this hayloft for a bunch of country bugs. So I hate a splintery stage. I don't know. I guess he had some kind of thing about splintery stages or something. But, they went on anyway. But Dorsey had one of the foulest mouths, I guess, in the world. I think he invented cuss words that are used today, actually. So I'm sure that's not all he said when he was complaining about the stage being splintered.